Welcome back, everybody. It feels like a very long time since 9 o'clock this morning, but we know from research on time perception that's because there's been so much to take in and so many interesting things happening. So the more new memories you make, the more time you feel has passed. So if it feels like a long time since this morning, that's a good thing, because it means that there's been all sorts going on, and there really has. And we want to, in this last session, reflect on the last couple of days, and also look forward a bit to the future of behavioural science and policy. And we have a short video of highlights to show you.
Well, it's not even 10 years since, in 2010, in number 10, we set up the Behavioural Insights team. And then I think we can pretty clearly say we have at least a half a dozen now $1 billion kind of interventions.
Indeed, the ideas and potential presented in Nudge are the reason that many of us are here in this room today, eager to learn about the new frontiers of behavioural science and how to apply it to our work.
The combination of creativity and commitment in this room is more than inspiring. Okay, my puzzle is, why does social change seem to come out of nowhere when it's often big? And correlative question, how can we start it or stop it?
A lot of what we've done are small tweaks. We take systems that people give us and we say, what are small things that we can do to improve it? However, I'm getting to realize more and more that we need to get into the design of tools.
If a choice affects me, then I should be the one that makes it, because I'm the one who knows best what determines my happiness.
So there are... I know some of those things barely happened minutes ago. It's quite impressive, isn't it? And they're already up there, which is very good. I mean, there are all sorts of highlights. There are so many things to pick on, but I'm just going to pick on a few. There was Cass Sunstein's opening speech, where he said that one of the 4 pillars for social change was that there are things in our heads that are not being said. And I really liked his example of the young men in Saudi Arabia who said they would support their wives if they wanted to work, but they believed that other men felt differently. And correcting this misperception increased the employment rate of their wives 4 months later. So it shows the kind of impact that things that can have. Seth Stevens-Davidovitz showed how analysing Google search trends can help show some of these unsaid things, and found that racist searches were the best predictor of Trump support in an area and better than more conventional indicators, which was interesting. There was a proposed new area of study, narrative economics, which we've been hearing a bit about. There was Robin Plomin on behavioural genetics and how much we can and can't predict from our DNA. There was lots of talk of challenges and some of the difficulties, but also a lot of focus on solutions. And one of my favourites is Sander van der Linden's work on tackling disinformation, and he's done lots on people's reluctance to use vaccines amongst some people, with a game where he teaches you to create fake news. I actually made a program about this, and almost found, after years and years of having BBC editorial guidelines instilled into me, that actually creating fake news was almost impossible. I found it hard to click on the thing to do it, because it felt so wrong, but so fun. Then there was Betsy Levy-Pollock and her really interesting work on getting people to sign consent pledges at the entrance to university parties to reduce sexual assault, which I thought was really interesting. And there were, of course, presentations from the BIT teams from across the world, and looking at the challenges of working in different countries with different experiences and different symptoms. And we've learnt a lot. There was the video, you might remember, about boosting aspiration among low-income groups in Kenya and how that improved savings rates. Then earlier there were our brave pitchers who went into the Dragon's Den to pitch their ideas about their financial apps. And a couple of facts. The fact from Laszlo Bock that we spend half as much on training as we do on marketing, and he says that almost all the money spent on training is wasted, so because it's not quite right. right, which is interesting. And then one quite extraordinary fact, which is going to stay with me, which was another one from Seth on how well we know ourselves, that the UK is possibly the only place in the world where people Google, you know what I'm going to say. You're listening, which is good, where people Google the weather more than they do porn. And all I can say is I have 2 weather apps on my phone and I constantly check them against each other, so that definitely must be true there. Now we've got another opportunity to hear some more from David Halpern and from Professor Dan Ariely, who we heard from this morning. I'd like to welcome them both onto the stage to join us here. And David Halpern is, of course, the author of the book Inside the Nudge Unit, and that has actually been updated specially for this conference, so that has lots of things that are updated in there. And we're going to, if you'd like to both come and sit here, and we'll have a chat. And so in a moment, we're going to hear from each of them about some of their thoughts. And I think it's been really clear from people talking today that both behavioural science and the application of it to policy have really advanced a lot in the last 5 years. And we've heard today and yesterday that there are masses of experiments out there, masses of things being done. And some of the challenges about the bigger ambitions. We heard from Dan this morning about the really big ambitions to try to change things in a bigger way. And I think it's really interesting to wonder how it is that behavioural science can have more of an impact, because I'm sure it can. I'm sure that there is more that can be done, and so it's interesting to think about what might be holding it back. Do we need more experiments, or do we need more buy-in from policymakers? I find if I mention behavioural science to people, so many people think it's nudge and nothing else, and we kind of need to know, so what is next after nudge? And also I was thinking in a time of political turbulence where the popular narrative is that trust in expertise is falling, although I know some argue about that. Is it going to get even harder to embed evidence into policy than before? It can feel that emotion is playing a very big part these days. And then, of course, there's the question of how to get enough really good evidence. And many academics haven't got the opportunity to do really big, large-scale studies. And so even if a small experiment has been replicated, is that enough to then take that forward and use this? But this still feels like such an exciting area. And I'm going to invite David to talk to us about some of his reflections of the last couple of days and where we think we're going in the future.
Thanks. And wonderful to see so many people caught up over the last 2 days. I do feel actually in the room you kind of embody what we were trying to do all those years ago, and now with so much bigger, more vibrant community too, which was this idea of trying to bridge between the world of ideas, particularly around behavioural science, better models of human beings, and indeed better methods. So reaching into the academic world, but also reaching into the world of practice and government, and to try and hold those things together, and actually be entrepreneurial. I mean, many of you know the original conception in 2010 in Downing Street was also to create a skunk work, a deliberately disruptive team, which would just kind of mess up and have some crazy ideas which would be thrown into the center of things. I think that still is an important part of it. And you see those, you can see it in the mix of the audience today, right? So you see the academics and you see the practitioners from amazing, from, as Rory said, was, only a few years ago, 2015, 20 countries now, 165 here in the room. The OECD estimate, a little while ago, more than 200 units now across the world. So it's really grown in that way, and also the entrepreneurs. So almost I thought it might be useful just to pick up on some of those areas about what things were most interesting, and also some of which are troubling we should reflect on more. But the most important thing being actually the synergy of holding those worlds together. And it's hard to do, right? It's hard to do for many of us. There are quite strong pressures on the academic community to get certain kind of publications out. There's quite strong pressures in the policy world to kind of do stuff privately and not talk about it too much, and and so on that could pull apart. So in the world of ideas, I do think one of the really interesting things we were keen to draw out this year, and it was fantastic having Bob Schiller, of course, talking about it, which is we felt for a while one of the ironies about specifically behavioral economics is it hasn't really got into economics very much, economic policy. And it's felt to us for a long time there's a sort of bastion of a set of ideas which are the kind of classical, which are still very alive and well in treasuries, where people sort of, as Keynes said, following the models of a long-dead economist. And I think Bob Schiller has really kind of helped to bring that alive about just how powerful that is, how it drives, of course, whole wider economic forces, but also it certainly drives the behavior of policymakers. And I think we should really, keep our eye on that. And I think actually, even in some of the other discussions, it just came from one about people talking about their favorite framework without going through them all. And one of the things to watch out for is that we'll all tend to have this drift back into a sort of assumption about the nature of our minds, that we are actually, push come to shove, kind of rational. And that we just got to work out just how treacherous that territory is and how easily we are drawn into it, including ourselves. We can just about, get the idea of other people are kind of maybe a bit irrational and get things wrong, but somehow we ourselves are not. Actually, I thought, Dan, your characterization was really elegant this morning around, you look around London, 300 years, absolutely, of evolution, technology, adaptation to deal with this, the physical capabilities, but what's the cognitive equivalent? To take a very concrete area, often around financial advice, financial behavior, the presumption is, well, how can we help people make, with education and so on, do better? So, well, that's just kind of crazy. We know from Leibson's work, it's really hard. We're not going to turn people into amazing financial analysts and so on. So we've got to be building the kind of leverage, the efforts, the tools to kind of, just as you say, like, we know we can't run as fast as a cheetah, so we build a car. But we're not as good, partly because, and indeed, Nick Chater in his session also with Seth, drawing this out about the grand illusion, it's very powerful about thinking about, sometimes overestimating what we can and can't do. And I think it traps us into thinking, our own internal model, even in this world, often gets it wrong. So I think that's very powerful and quite deep. I thought the session with Seth and Nick are still here, really interesting. I thought that itself was pretty interesting in terms of, I don't know if you've read, those who read both books, because they have very different views of the world. Is it that Google, fine, what does this mean about us, that we're searching more for the weather than porn? Is it very, very deep, like we've always wanted to be able to look into the minds of others, right? This is an amazing, powerful tool. Whether that's freaky or not, I don't know. But then Nick is saying, actually, no, that's wrong. What you're seeing is a sort of shadow. Like, it's actually some quite deep questions which we should wrestle with. We should wrestle with the nature of these ideas and what it means to be human, and so on. I thought, obviously, Cass's talk was fantastic and powerful and personal, and so on. And then also in the mix, things like, Richard Ploman's work about genetics, which, again, is quite challenging to who we are. It's like, we don't really want to think about the fact that how much of it's just somehow determined by that DNA. It's like, do we, so, and let alone what the policy implications. We can just about get our head around the idea of, precision medicine, maybe a different pill for you. But when we think about your kids, actually, let's do their genetic profiling and work out, what stream to put them in. That's kind of uncomfortable, right? So, so the world of ideas remains vibrant, and we need to stay in contact with it and anticipate as policymakers. With practices, absolutely, what's going on, the fake news session, incredibly interesting, relevant to many, many governments. And one thing, by the way, to bear in mind is that, look, the UK is a reasonably sized country, 60-odd million people, well, at the moment. See in how many more years. Anyway, but if you want to talk about social media, it's not enough for individual governments to take on those issues. You actually have to collaborate across countries to figure out what are your policy levers in order to do something. Anyway, lots of other interesting sessions. The Chicago one I was on crime earlier today I thought was really interesting. And one of the questions often comes up, well, but some of those interventions are very effective, but are they really nudges? Our view has always been, to some extent, who cares? We're interested in human beings, a rounded account, understand them better. Will it take us to better kinds of solutions? So we've always taken a very broad view, and I think that's right. I hope other people feel the same, around that sort of set of issues about what's possible. And again, we had Kevin Collins here, who I'm a big fan of, from the Educational Endowment Foundation, our What Works Centre. And I think that's a glimpse into one of the great things that behavioral science has acted as, kind of a Trojan horse in some ways. It's brought very strong empirical methods into the heart of a number of governments. And I've often felt, even if you didn't care about the behavioral science, that is an unbelievable game changer. I think people talk about, we had enough with experts or whatever. I do think the arc of history is generally the right way, right? We are able to talk more and more about, actually, of course, it's the right thing to do to test and figure it out. For those who don't follow the intimacy of UK policy in and out, we recently released, we in the UK, another fund called the Youth Endowment Fund, which is actually 200 million on violent crime, particularly affecting young people. And it's very much modelled on the Educational Endowment Foundation. Let's try out lots of things, see what work. Literally more than 1 million kids have been in these trials. One of the details about it, I mean, crime has always been incredibly politically contentious. You're under enormous pressure to say in most governments, yeah, we're tough on it, we're doing the right thing. This endowment is 10 years of money, 200 million set out there. Governments let it go, it's independent. It's going to try out, does the Chicago model work in Britain? Let's find out, and vice versa. And then it's also going to try out new things with the expectation of an 80% failure rate, right? That's like, I mean, there are a lot of ministers who are like, really, we're doing what, But actually, that is how it should be, I'm afraid, when we have to mature to that, and we have to be able to talk about, even in this, everyone wants to hear about the things that work, to also talk about things that didn't work. And why didn't they work? And why did it work there and not there? And then iterate back to the theory to understand, what's going on. So on the practice. And then finally, of course, in entrepreneurship, to have and maintain some of that energy of trying different, new things. Again, actually, I thought a lot of us loved your evil app. The one, for those who didn't catch it. I didn't call it evil. I think you did. What did you call it? The one that,
Angry.
Was it angry? It seems angry, a bit more than angry if it's deleting your other apps. If you're not, I'm not, sorry, you haven't eaten a salad today. Oh shit, you've just deleted my diary. I kind of absolutely wonderful in a kind of mischievous way, but we should have a space for that, room for the entrepreneurialism. A kind of final thought, I was just reflecting. If I have one little disappointment the last couple of days, I mean, it's just been incredible, energizing. For those of you who ever go to Davos, this is so much better than Davos. Oh my God. Don't ever go there again. But I was actually scrolling at the BBC. What are the stories of the day? Obviously, there's a lot going on, and some pretty obvious top stories. But I think about some of the things which people have presented here today and the significance, and then I look at some of the BBC stories, and I'm like, really? Really? Is that story more interesting than what we just heard in this room? And that's an interesting challenge, again, about actually how is that out there, and just a kind of final comment. When I was and Ed was helping me do the kind of introductory comments at the beginning of this yesterday. I had a kind of, we're maturing. I was going to use a different metaphor, which I'll go back to now, which is an old one from London, which is, a couple hundred years, particularly, and Faraday in Britain, for those who are, physics-type backgrounds. Faraday was doing this work where he showed, science was kind of amateur hour at those times. You didn't have, quite differentiated, and it was kind of a club thing. You go around, whatever, Royal Society. And we now say famously, Faraday showed this thing where basically if you put electrical current around, a wire, it generates a magnetic field, and essentially the wire moves a little bit. And a lot of the reaction was so what? Like you move the wire this much, so what? Of course, we now know the answer to so what. It's like entirely changed the world, right? Electromagnetism and TV and phones and a million other things. Actually, there's a little bit of that about the behavioral science world still. It's like, so you managed to tweak this little letter, or you made this little thing, or change the default, and you got a few, people. So what? Actually, to see behind it just how radical that is, using that empiricism, using these different models, getting away from these models that are in people's minds, many of our minds, our senior policymakers too, which are wrong, is really a radical agenda. And it's still very, very young, and it's got a long, long way to go. So I think incredible energy with it, but also where there's a lot of people who aren't in this room, who actually, it is already changing their lives, and actually to have that out there, and indeed have that appropriate public discussion about what that means.
I think that's so true. And Dan, can you give me some of your reflections of today, and also where you think it's going in the future?
So two things. I want to describe kind of two projects and what I think this means about how we go about doing our work. So the first one is connected to this question of are we tweaking or are we starting fresh? And in this particular project, we started thinking about, from scratch, we said, how would you help people lose weight? Lots of ways, right? We can all come up with different ways. And we said, okay, what are some of the principles that we would want? So the first principle was to try and be healthy. You have to be healthy every day of the week. It doesn't work if you do it 5 days a week. And it was also clear you have to start from the morning. You can't start after lunch. So if you take those two principles, if you take those two principles and you say I need to start in the morning, that's good constraints. And then we also wanted something to remind people, right? We know that we don't remember our need to take care of our health, so we wanted something that we see physically in our morning. So it's either the electrical toothbrush or the bathroom scale. Said, okay, for all kinds of reasons, we chose the bathroom scale. And then we said, okay, what do we know about the bathroom scale? And we studied the bathroom scale for a while. And we learned 3 things about the bathroom scale. The first thing, it's really good to stand on your bathroom scale every morning. It's not so good to stand in the evening. And the reason is not that we increased our weight, we do, but the reason that the morning is good is it's a ritual that reminds us to take care of our health. So if people step on the scale in the morning, they eat a little bit less for breakfast. You step on the scale at night, you just go to bed, by the morning you forgot the whole thing. Good thing to do every morning, first thing before breakfast. The second thing is weight fluctuates a lot. People with kind of normal BMI, it might be a kilo to 1.5 kilos a day. People that are morbidly obese, it could be 4 kilos a day. Now, what does this fluctuation happen? It's about how much salt you had and when you went to the bathroom and so on. And this fluctuation creates the opposite for loss aversion, right? It's gain aversion. Days when your weight goes up is really miserable. Days your weight goes down is slightly happy. But think about this. Highly miserable, slightly happy. Highly miserable, slightly happy. On average, people don't enjoy this process, right? And you can think to yourself, how many of you are looking forward to stepping on your scale tomorrow? Right? Just not very few. And then the third thing that we figured out is that people expect their bodies to react very quickly. Right? People say to themselves, I've been on a diet since yesterday morning. Right? I didn't eat anything, I had a salad, I went for a walk, like where is the result? The body sadly takes 8 days to 2 weeks to process these changes, but our naive theory is that we expect things to happen very quickly. So think about the experience of stepping on a scale. You've been on a diet for 4 days. Like it certainly has to change, but no. Your weight can go up by 0.5 kilo. It's very depressing. So we said, okay, let's think about those things. First thing in the morning, we don't want to see the variations. The effect is more delayed than people expect. What should we do? We decided to do a scale with no display. Right? We said it's a good idea to step on a scale every morning. Let's get people to step on the scale and say, congratulations, you've done your job. And the feedback, certainly we want feedback, but maybe the feedback is wrong. So we decided to give the feedback in bands. By the way, what do you think? Is it better to give a 5-point feedback or 4? Like imagine the 4 is much worse, slightly better, much better, or 5-point scale, much worse, slightly worse, nothing happened, slightly better, and much better.
Better on what outcome?
It's what?
Better on what outcome?
Reducing weight.
Okay.
Turns out 5-point scale is much better. Why? Because most of life is nothing bad happen. In fact, nothing bad happen is great news in health. Right? Imagine you have a whole year and you lose weight 10 weeks and the rest of them nothing bad happens. Fantastic. But naturally, we don't interpret nothing bad happen as good news. So 5-point scale is better. And we tested this scale. We took 1,000 people from 4 call centers around the US. These are basically low income, slightly obese, some of them more than slightly obese individual. A population that is tough to change. People who got the regular scale gained 0.3% of their body weight every month for 5 months on average. People who got our scale lost 0.6% of their body weight every month for 5 months. But think about the principles, right? The principle is that as social scientists, we can look at every ordinary object, including a scale. And when we used to have the mechanical scale, some of you remember, we had like a thick needle and we didn't really know how much our weight was, and it was actually okay. And then we moved to the digital era, and we said, let's put the scale exactly where it was and put 2 decimals on top of it. Not a good idea, right? And for me, there's actually a really fundamental question here, which is, what is data for? Is data for accuracy? Well, maybe not. For me, data is to help people understand the relationship between cause and effect. What have I done? Stopped eating cookies? What happened? And maybe the variance is making it harder. And also the data is to keep us motivated. So if you think about data as a source of motivation and a source of understanding the relation between cause and effect, maybe we should give up precision. And we can expand to other ideas too. Think about your bank account. What you have right now in your checking account is what you have right now in your checking account. But if your mortgage is coming out in 3 days, Is this really what you have in your checking account? Yes or no? Not so much. So anyway, for me, that kind of approach of taking something and starting from behavioral principles rather than starting from what we have right now is an incredibly useful approach. And once you start doing it, and if you discover evidence in your direction, there's all kinds of other things to do with it. For example, think about diabetes. Diabetes is a very hard thing to fight. Should we report to people their A1C, their measure of the last 3 months of ability to manage their diabetes? It's basically a losing battle. It's very hard to maintain diabetes. It's basically going down. For most people, it's just going down. And if you're really good, it will go down slightly less fast than what is expected. That's victory. Do we naturally think about victory as things going slightly worse down the hill? No. Maybe we need to recalibrate. Maybe we need to think differently about how we represent data to make people feel successful when they should be, and to make people understand the relationship between cause and effect. So that's one, I think, kind of question about where we're going. I think we need to start more things from scratch, right? Rather than, I'm not against tweaking. Tweaking is great, but I think we do need to start from scratch and start from basic principles. The second comment I want to make is that I've always been like a lab person doing RCTs, and some things are just tough to do with RCTs. I'll give you one example. I've been doing lots of experiments, RCTs on motivation. And one of the sad things about motivation is I go into almost any company and I change something, and it's always easy to show improvement. And it's sad because it means people don't really think about motivation that deeply, because otherwise it wouldn't be so easy to improve. But in this particular case, I got data, goes back to 2006, about 800 companies, American companies. So think about 800 companies, data from 2006, sampled at least once yearly, about 80 dimensions of how companies treat their employees. And a dimension could be quality of furniture, or a dimension could be quality of salary between men and women, or a dimension could be how safe people feel in this company, or how fair they feel about their compensation. 80 different dimensions. And I played a very simple game. I said, imagine I took one dimension, let's say quality of furniture, and I go back to 2006 when I got the first set of data. And I sort the companies from the company who treats their employees best on quality of furniture to companies who treat their employees worse on quality of furniture. And I imagine that I bought in 2006, in the 2006 stock market prices, the companies who treated their employees best on quality of furniture, the 20% best companies. And I kept that portfolio. And in 2007, I got new data. Maybe a company went up, a company went down, and I changed my portfolio. And I kept a portfolio from 2006 to 2018 of companies who treat best their employees on quality of furniture, equality of salary between men and women, and so on. From these almost 80 dimensions, how many do you think are as good or better than the S&P 500? Turns out all but one. Huh? And the one that loses by a little bit. Right? Now that should be kind of shocking, right? Because it says that there's almost nothing. I told you about everything I could measure. I didn't said, oh, here's the top thing. I mean, no, everything. Basically, it's very hard to measure how companies treat their employees and not beat the S&P 500. By the way, the opposite is true for the companies who treat worse their employees on all of those dimensions. If you buy those stocks, you basically guarantee to lose money compared to the S&P 500. But some dimensions were slightly better than the S&P 500, and some were really better. Now it's the question for us, right, social scientists. Which dimensions were important? And some of the data surprised me, some didn't. So it turns out, for example, that salary doesn't matter so much. Fairness in salary matters a lot. It turns out that if you look at companies, and most companies treat women worse than men, if you look at this gap between how women are being treated and men, the bigger the gap, the more sign this is to short the company, or at least not to buy it. It turns out quality of furniture doesn't matter. Sorry for WeWorks and the like. The answer to a question such as, I feel that in this company honest mistakes are valued, was one of the most important questions. People want to feel a sense of autonomy. People want to feel a sense of agency. People want to feel transparency, being treated fairly. All of those things really matter, the deep emotional things. The stuff like occasional recognition, salary, even employee benefit don't matter that much. By the way, if I take the 18 parameters that I find out are the most important, and I create an index from them from 2006 until today, that index beats the S&P by 12% a year. That's a big deal, right? Companies do a lot of things to slightly improve their percentage. By the way, it's very interesting if you think about this. CEOs stand on stage and say, my employees are the best asset I have. There's nobody who doesn't say it. But then you think, how do companies actually treat employees? Not so much. When a company buys a warehouse, it's an investment in their annual report. When a company invests in employees, it's a cost, right? If you think about our whole approach, is incredible in how low people are. Actually, HR in most companies is a very low function. I mean, nobody looks at them like R&D. It's considered like maybe just above compliance, but you know, that's about that. That's the lawyers in the room, I'm guessing. So I want to make 2 points about this. One is that RCTs are great. Some things like the stock market are really hard to play with RCTs, and we need to get into the data game separately from RCTs. We just have to admit that some things we need to just expand our flexibility. And I very much have been wrong in this for a long time when I thought, you know, experimental stuff, all the people who are not experimental, second-class citizens at best. No, I think we need to be a bit more open for that. But the second thing is that once we discover those things now, the question is, what do you do? So first of all, when we discover this, I start investing this way. So my money is, I'm buying the companies who treat their employees well. I short the companies who don't. But more than my own investment strategy, the question is, how do we get this data out there? And what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to pass a law in the US that would force companies to start measuring how they treat their employees and put it on their annual reports. Right? That's one direction, and that's coming from the legislator out. But the second approach is to go to companies and say, here's some things we found. Because, you know, the reality is that there are lots of companies who are, even if they're well-meaning, they don't know what to do. Very hard for companies to figure out what actually works for employee motivation and what doesn't. I mean, how can they do experiments? They really can't. So now it's part of our job to go to companies and say, here's the list of the 18 things that really matter. Why don't you start measuring this way? And for me, this is a second a bit more flexible in terms of what data we find convincing and not, and think of it as a continuum, right? There's great data, there's sort of great data. Let's try and move down that path. But the other thing is not just to wait for government intervention. So if I could get the government now to regulate that and to start forcing companies to start measuring employee motivation, that would be great, but that will take a long time. How do we get private industry to work as well? And this is a case where there's a win-win, right? Everybody would want employees that are more motivated as it comes to improvement in the stock market. And I think that's another thing that we need to do. In some of the discussions, it seems like people think that government and enterprise are on opposite sides, and sometimes we are, but sometimes enterprise is actually at the public service as well, and we might want to think about how do we take our findings and basically help everybody, whether it's government or private enterprise.
And so in order to do all this, in order to expand the flexibility and to do things from scratch, what do we need more of? Do we need more lab research, or do we have enough findings now? Is it a question of putting them into practice in places and then doing huge experiments? Or is it more about getting policymakers on board as well to let them know what's there? What would you say? What do we need more of for behavioural science to have a bigger impact?
Well, and empirical methods. I mean, one of the things, look, it's great, ESRC and LSE and others have been involved in this event. And of course there are many academics in the room, but how can we crowd in more of that kind of activity? One of the things, particularly my What Works hat on, I often think about what's the right level of R&D for a government. You know, VW, the car company, spends pretty much more than the entire UK R&D budget. we have an aspiration to get to the OECD average.
It doesn't include their payment for the diesel thing.
Yeah. But aiming for a 2.4% overall in the economy. But what's the equivalent for public service? What's the equivalent that we're doing to try and figure out how do you design a better welfare system, right? Or encourage people to live more sustainably? Or of course, when you think about it, it makes sense. You've got these massive legacy systems doing things we did yesterday, and they'll do the same tomorrow. You have to create spaces where you're prepared to innovate and take chances. And that includes both so-called marginal gains, smaller tweaks, as you put it, but it should also include space for, in my view, I'm a big advocate of innovation funds which are truly radical different things, which is what you were pushing in your remarks earlier too. It's like sometimes tweak, you want more than tweaks, you want to rebuild the whole damn system, right? I actually came from a session on, was presenting Help to Save, which is very interesting, very generous scheme, very few people are taking it up. In our view, you can tweak, and there's some nice adjustments to try and encourage people with the existing scheme, but actually we really need to rebuild the scheme. For rainy day saving more generally. So how are we going to create those kind of spaces? How do we kind of welcome in more from the academic community? How do we get more? Look, it's 1,000 people in the room. That's pretty good. But actually, we want to have far more people. We should have routinely public service practitioners should be able to experiment, test, do variations. So I think when you set it in that kind of context, you realize, hey, it's pretty good, but then like that's the half full. The half empty is, oh my God, 98% of government expenditure or something, we don't really know if it works, let alone if it's something better.
So what would your advice be for academics here who might have really good ideas about what they can do and what they can put into practice, but to try and do them on the scale, like you were talking this morning about having 160,000 people in your samples for some things, it's very hard for them to do it on the scale that the BIT's been able to do. How can academics do it?
One thing that's happened, which maybe other governments want to fill, which might be an important clue to the future. We've got our big government departments to publish what are called ARIs, Areas of Research Interest, which in other words, we had privately called them things that we don't know the answer to, but we really should. And for some reason, that working title wasn't the final one. But it's a really important question to figure out what you don't know. And one of the ideas was you put that alongside. If government's prepared to more, it's a really hard thing to do, figure out what you don't know the answer to, and then say, kind of invite, as it were, the academic, the research, and the entrepreneurial community say, hey, that is an interesting puzzle. How would you find a solution for it? So I think to populate that area much more fully, informationally, but also, frankly, it does require funding, which maybe not enough of it goes. Because it requires funding. You don't need very many innovations and successes to have it paid back tenfold.
But you'd have to be able to accept that some won't work, presumably.
You absolutely do. So I keep driving home this, and I'm quite aware of it. Look, BIT is an unusual entity. We're a social purpose company, co-owned by British government still, and so on. But a lot of our work, therefore, we're hired by others, as you may be finding, of course, in Israel, for example. The truth is, a lot of our departments are less keen on sharing the results that don't work. That's really important, right? And then you have a secondary issue, which is around implementation. It's a young enough discipline, it's only just beginning to hit that. You can have some amazing results, it's of course rehearsed around the replication crisis, but that was really, really neat, and then you try it again, it's like, oh crap, it didn't work. We don't give up. That I'm afraid, guys, that's how it's going to be. You're going to have lots of bumps in the road. And to illustrate it, so if it's not too obscure, I have my shelf in the office, a copy of James Lynn's original study on the Treatise on Scurvy, which I'm sure you've all read very well, 1753. Why is it relevant? It's often considered the first published randomized controlled trial. All these sailors are dying from scurvy, it's a horrible, nasty disease. Unbelievable numbers are dying. And then James Lynn comes along and he shows if you give some lemons, basically, oh, the guys are fine. But an interesting detail is it takes more than 50 years for the British Navy to adopt it as practice. Well, that's part of the story. And why is it? If you read James Lynn's original book, a lot of it's cookery. He's trying to figure out this problem of, it seems to be lemon. How do you keep lemons fresh at sea? That's not a trivial matter, right? And if you're in a hurry, what do? You boil it down to get a concentrate. And what does that do? We now know is it destroys the acetic acid. So he gets this core idea, really neat. Lots of people then try and replicate it, and it doesn't work. So it kind of goes backwards and forwards, and we're going to see some of that. We're going to see things like, that's really neat. Someone tries it. Oh, crap, it didn't work. Let's give up on that behavioral science thing, right? So we have to brace ourselves for that expectancy that we're going to have some shocks and steps backwards and forwards as we tune and understand kind of the active ingredient that makes this intervention work or not.
And Dan, what would you advise to people, you know, if they're academics or others here who want to take these things further and who want to test more things?
So I'm in a relatively lucky position. We created a center at Duke that is aimed at doing good. And when we have projects, we don't ask the question of where can we publish it. We ask the question of how many people would this help and by how much, and we multiply those two numbers. And if the number is big enough, we say let's do it. And if the number is not, we say let's not. And it's a really very privileged position because of funding, right? So we find other ways to get our research funded. And you know, I think, you know, academia has its role, and I actually don't want all academics to be like me. I think academics should do what academics do, but a few should be a bit more applied-minded. And I don't think academia should change. I think just some people, it's enough. I mean, if every university had one research center like this from 1,000 faculty, that would be great. The question is, how do we do a little bit of that? It's not how do we change everybody. How do we do a little bit of this? And I think similar for BAT, how do we find enough breadth or, you know, in research that is not necessarily sponsored by projects, that people can pursue something that looks interesting and then hopefully that one day we'll do that. So finding the flexible funding for both academia and government units, I think, is like R&D, like proper applied R&D is incredibly important. And then the other interesting thing is that when you look at academics, academics have like pet theories. Right? Most academics have a pet theory, and they look for a study that would study their theory. Now, the odds that that theory is the best thing to do as a next step to improve something is very low because, you know, that's the nature of the beast. And people need to recognize that there's some give and take. That, you know, you want to test your pet theory, maybe I'll let you, but I want to do something else at the same time. The goal of moving the needle forward on the human condition and the goal of advancing the next pet theory are not necessarily so compatible. And for that, I think people need to have a portfolio. So you know, over the years, we've discovered lots of academics who want to do things, and from time to time, we draw different things for different projects. You've done the same thing. So it's like a match-matching approach that you say, here's a body that tries to do applied work, and let's draw the right people when they have a little bit of extra time, but we need to do it in a more systematic way.
So you've both said what you think should happen. Finally, looking into your crystal ball, what do you think we will be talking about? I don't know, maybe in 5 years' time here, what we'll be talking about? What sort of fields, what sort of areas? What would you say, Dan?
So, you know, I think the question of funding is really important. I'm a big fan of social bonds. There's all kind of increase around that, and I think there's a real potential. And I think the right way to do social bond is a social bond where you really experiment in a brave way up front. So you're not like defining one little experiment you could do to just pass the threshold of what the government dictated, but you go all out and try a few risky things. So I think that will be part of the discussion, is how do we take risk, how do we create social bonds. And then I think the other part of it is there's some big topics that we haven't started touching. End of life being a really important one, right? Every meal ends with a dessert. Like, you know, we try to end things on a high point and then we end life in a most miserable way imaginable. The amount of misery and pain and financial spending. So I think we haven't done that. I think we've done only tweaks around education. And people spend so many years of education, and then I get them as freshmen, right? It's like something doesn't add up after so long. So I think for me, it's the big moral ticket items on health and education that we really haven't dealt. I mean, we've dealt with a little bit of things, but not the essence. And those, I hope would come to the table.
And David, what do you think we should look out for? What will we see in a few years' time?
Yeah, of course, partly this is an optimistic. Let's go with
That's
that.
allowed.
But I think realistic. So on the topics, we already see that. You see the range of issues which people are taking on in this room. They are increasingly very big issues, and many of them are still early days. So issues of social cohesion has featured pretty majorly, as well as Cass and others referring about how does change occur more deeply, social change. That's what does in most societies. It's conflict, right, of various kinds, literally wars and so on. I think we're quite aware of, we've done that at the margin, and we feel like, why on earth is that at the margin? Right, it is absolutely what drives conflict. Greg Powell, who's talking about, for those who caught his session, around literal physical fights in parliaments across the world, not yet, I think, in ours, but recently. But what does it make people get along? Right? It's just so fundamental. Obviously, big issues around climate change, issues around corruption. Actually, it's a huge issue with very few things that are really effective. It's not just about money. Actually, do you have to sleep with your teacher to get your grades? That's a pretty big issue, I would say. I've said I think economic policy. I really honestly believe that if we follow the logic of what this is telling us, a number of areas, opens a whole range of policy levers which we just haven't pulled on the economy. And when we look at issues in the UK, we have a lot of discussions around low productivity. There are variations on that themes elsewhere. It is really possible to improve underlying economic performance. I honestly believe that. And I feel we haven't even got out of bed on it. So I'd love to have some examples where you could really see that, oh, look, we made this market intervention and look what it did. And then one last one. Allied quite closely to the behavioral science literature has been reflections on well-being. Dan's been in that space, Dan Gilbert. In the UK government, of course, with Cameron, we introduced the measures on well-being and so on. And there's a good reason for that, which you'll know from your own work, is that those same biases affect our judgments about what made us happy and what will make us happy. And that's quite a profound question to re-inject into, when particularly economists and others talk about what someone wants, is to unpack what that really means, and then to build mechanisms that enable us to choose it. To me, so that goes, if that was topics, there's a load of things about institutions, which would go to funding environment, maybe SIBs, maybe not, innovation funds. It would probably take us to different institutions. We've been big fans of deliberative forums. I mean, actually not much discussion about how we discuss that, who nudges the nudges, how you make decisions in a society in an intelligent way. But I think people, I do think, in the question about, it often goes to resources rapidly. But, if you're 25, 30, you have lots of choice about what you do with your life. And when you talk to people like Richard Thaler and so on, they feel like they've had to sort of toe the line in many ways through their careers until the point they're really eminent and they can let their hair down. I mean, actually nothing seemed to stop you along the way, which is interesting. But for most, when they actually like, oh, let's do the stuff which is really important. I don't have to publish in that journal so much. I really hope that in the time frame you're talking about, that for many of you, for example, doing your PhDs at the moment, you won't have to make that same choice. You will be able to say, because you'll have institutions like BIT, and we're doing stuff in many other countries, and the door is open if academics want to engage with us. We'd love it. So actually, I don't have to choose between being an academic and being a policymaker and being an entrepreneur. I can do all those things in an integrated way, right? In institutions that we are sort of creating, like BIT and in other institutions or work centers. So that's pretty cool and exciting, actually. And I feel like, it is really exciting and vibrant to be doing the kind of stuff we do, and I hope that many younger researchers and scholars will also think that too.
Yeah, I hope so. So that is 5 years ahead for what might be happening, but looking a bit closer to next year, which is already exciting. We are delighted to announce that BX2020 will be hosted by the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. And I would like to invite onto the stage Melanie Kim, who's Associate Director of the Bear Centre at the University of Toronto, and Liz Hardy, who manages the behavioural science team in the Government of Canada, to come up onto the stage and to receive the blue baton from David.
Run like slow motion. Run in slow motion.
Is that what I'm going to do? Are you ready, guys? Over to Canada.
Thank you so much, David. We are so excited to be hosting the next Behavioral Exchange Conference. It'll be the second time that it's returning to North America and the first time to Canada. We have a fabulous community of behavioral insights researchers, practitioners, and enthusiasts from Canada, some of whom are here today, and we can't wait to have you all join us in Toronto. Okay, great. So as of today, the webpage is live and registration is open at
There's a nudge for you.
BX2020.org. So some of you who have your phones, if you type in that address, you'll see a page like the next slide. And now, we all know that procrastination is a human trait, and the last thing that we want you to do is fall prey to it. So please go register while it's top of mind, and we promise you the registration will be a sludge-free experience. So, by the way, early registration is until February 2020. Finally, thank you again for such a wonderful conference. And on behalf of the organizing committee at Bayer, Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, we look forward to seeing many of you in Toronto. Thank you.
And hi, I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the Government of Canada. I'm acutely aware that I'm standing between you and a cold beer, so I will just keep this very short and just say that I am unbelievably honored and thrilled that the event is coming to Canada. I've spent the last 7 years building 2 BI teams, one at the provincial level and now at the federal level, and I have had the absolute pleasure of watching this practice grow and evolve in Canada, thanks in large part to teams like Heather Devine's Behavioral Insights Group in the Government of British Columbia, also, of course, Bayer. So thank you. I hope to see you all in Toronto in 2020. Thanks.
David, you wanted to say a quick...
I just want to say, yeah, thank you. By the way, of course, I'm delighted that we also now have a BI team set up in Canada, so that'll be wonderful to help you with that, hopefully, too. I just want to say...
Do you remember the early meeting we had in Canada with all these French bureaucrats? How awful it was? Do you remember the...
Don't put people off.
Diplomatical. Anyway, the main thing actually just to say thank you for coming, but also there's a huge amount of work that goes into setting up an event like this, as you guys are about to discover. But particularly, you know, well, Susie and who else we got? Katie and others who've been working ridiculous amounts. I think we've got some gift for you. Is that right? Yeah.
Oh.
But otherwise, and to all those people in blue t-shirts, to say thank you.
And we're just winding up now. We'd also like to thank all of the sponsors and partners, in particular the London School of Economics, the Economic and Social Research Council, which is part of UK Research and Innovation, Nature, Human Behaviour and Behavioural Public Policy. Now, when I had the choice of which of the parallel sessions to go to, I know I was torn because there were so many interesting things. So anyone who wishes they could have been able to be in 3 places at once and gone to everything, all of everything has been videoed and they will all be uploaded to the BX website next week, and you will get an email when they're ready, so you can watch all the things you missed. So you could spend next Thursday and Friday doing it at the exact same times. Make yourself some food, and, you know, it won't be the same, but, you know, anyway, they will all be there. But thank you to all of you, and people have asked such good questions all day as well. And it's been really interesting seeing all the questions coming up, and people have really engaged, which is really great. And so thank you so much to all of you for being part of this community and making this the biggest BX yet. Do stay for a drink, and maybe see you in Toronto next year. Thank you.